Hello, and welcome to the 31st episode of the Mike McNair Revolutionary Strategy Series. Today is Friday, the 22nd of November 2019, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. We have some more terrible abuse of the Trot-sect mania today, as we eventually finish Chapter 8, Political Consciousness. Hail to the death of the chapter which never ends. If you'd like to keep the good ship Alpha afloat, why not join the Patreon gang? From $5 a month or $1 an episode, you get access to the special Patreon only bonus episodes, the right to vote on the reading group series, and other cool stuff too. We're closing in on the magic 100 patrons, which means we'll soon be producing a second patron only podcast every month. If you think money is evil, it is. You could also help me producing and editing the show. Hit me up on Twitter or Facebook if this is your non-single use bag. If you'd like to comment on the show, please do it on the YouTube channel. Okay, to the discussion. Right, who wants to read the next bit? Let's put Pouya last. Pouya deserves to be last.
Pouya? Oh no.
Yeah.
So we're here at 2-3 many internationals.
This shit gets good.
In the world between the opening of the Cold War in 1948 and the beginning of the open political crisis of the USSR in the 1980s, official communism appeared to be a strategic way forward for the global working class, and apolitical trade unionism and social democratic coalitionism appeared to be a strategic way forward for the working class in the imperialist countries. Although Comintern had been wound up in 1943, the official communists had a form of international, the Common Form. The CPSU had discovered that a consultative international secured freedom from accountability as effectively as an open bureaucratic dictatorship and with fewer overhead costs. This situation posed for the Trotskyists the question, what was their international for? In 1953, they split between the majority Pabloite advocates of a tactic of large-scale fraction work in the communist parties and their anti-Pabloite opponents who insisted on building parties organizationally separate from the official communists among the milieu of the French socialists, British Bevonites, and Rooseveltian Democrat trade unionists. The split was characterized by bureaucratic centralism on both sides, as first the International Executive Committee expelled the majority of the French section, and then the US SWP and British section expelled minorities in their organizations that supported the Pabloite international majority. The minority formed an international committee, but turned out to be unable to produce anything more than the occasional liaison meetings between the French, British, and US full-timers. In due course, the national components went their separate ways, with the usual round of expulsions. Each created an openly bureaucratic centralist Trotentern, or a formally consultative Trottenform, with its own party in the role of the CPSU. This was the legacy of Comintern's chain of revolution as idea, and the leading role of the Comintern of the most advanced party, with the American, British, and French each imagining that they were the most advanced. The Pabloites after 1960, the Mandelites, did a little better. They preserved the forms of an international organization with center, leadership, international congresses, and press, and a degree of internal democracy in their organizations. In the early 1970s, they even began to develop continental perspectives and centers and horizontal relations between sections. But if you asked them what their international was for, the only answer they could give was to be a center where the international experiences of the mass movement and of the revolution are progressively assimilated. At the end of the day, this is to say no more than the Fourth International must exist because it must. Their international had become the Mandelites' sectarian shibboleth, which distinguished them from their Trotskyist competitors in individual countries. The insistence of the Mandelites that no one could be a Trotskyist without the Fourth International pressed the national groups, even quite large ones, such as the French Lutte Ouvrière and the British Militant and SWP, to create their own. The 1953 split, and all the more the 1971 split between the British and French anti-Pavlovites, had the effect of legitimizing multiple internationals around Trotskyists. At this point, we have arrived at today's world of Trotskyist sect internationals, although the full Baroque elaboration was not to arrive until the 1980s. The Trotten forms are, like the Common form, just as much creatures of bureaucratic centralism as the Comintern and the Fourth International at its most centralist period. For example, the British SWP's international socialist tendency is not formally democratic centralist, i.e. bureaucratic centralist, but this tendency can nonetheless expel the U.S. International Socialist Organization for supporting a minority faction in Greece in 2003.
Rip.
Oh my god.
When I first read this, I knew he was going to fall on the side of the Pavlovites.
Yeah.
Oh, I just think earlier in the book, he basically expresses like them as like his favorite Trot-sect.
It would make sense, right? Because the split between the Pavlovites, the followers of the Greek Marxist Michel Pablo, and Pablo isn't his real name, but I don't know what his real name is. And basically, they are doing entryism into the Communist Party versus entryism into the Social Democratic Party. Yeah, it would make sense that he would appreciate the form of Trotskyism that's trying to organize within the split from social democracy, not running back into the arms of social democracy.
I mean, they sound basically kind of like McNair's.
Yeah.
You know, they're trying to build a faction within the larger...
They're also more internationalist, right?
Yeah, this is all part of why I wanted to actually get into this, because, you know, how much of this stuff is going to recapitulate, you know, Pabloism, more or less, or Mandelism? I don't know. Like, that's sort of like a broader question.
I quite like Mandel's writings.
Yeah, he edited a book with Alan Freeman. That's a good Marxist economics book. So he's an interesting, like, serious guy. And, you know, as far as, like, Trots go, yeah, like, that original sort of, I don't know. I guess what he's really saying is that the structure of that stuff, in the same way that he appreciates, like, post-Stalin but pre-Euro-communist, like, official Communist Party period, like, from that, like, Euro-communist point onward, his organizational allegiances are with these Pablovites, I suppose. I guess I would put it that they're doing everything that, you know, alienated intellectuals can do, except that they don't actually have a reason for being. And I really wonder how much of this applies to what McNair wants to do.
I don't know. It would seem like McNair is a Pabloite. Is that what we're saying? To trying to reform the Communist Party along democratic lines?
Well, I mean, it's definitely like an improvement on Pabloism to abandon the first four Congresses and Cominternism and all that shit.
Yeah.
And he said here that also the Pavlovites had their own splits and their own expulsions of certain groups, but yeah.
It sounds like he likes what the Pavlovites were doing before they became too trot for their own good and started splitting and purging and all that. Like that strategic line of, you know, entering the larger Communist Party as like a faction and doing entryism into that. Like, I think that's kind of like his bread and butter. And so he wants that, but without the trot baggage, basically.
And does this sort of get into the CPGB's like weird non-party party position? Because he is criticizing the Pavlovites on the basis of their organization and its existence became the only reason their organization existed, right? Like, it just perpetuating the international as like the true embodiment of communist principle was the only reason for that international to exist. I don't know, maybe that sort of avoidance of the party among the CPGB could be related to that problem that he identifies.
I don't know. I have this like this drive in me, you know, whenever I see these like mass movements pop up and go down, and I realize that, you know, the enemies of mass movements have these cumulative institutions that can build on strategy and kind of do trial and error and, you know, think can you know, think historically and kind of collect their experiences. Yeah, it strikes me that you know what we need? We need an organization that can collect these experiences and give them to the masses when they take up struggle. Usually when there is like a sort of mass thing, the organizations that are around kind of like thumb their nose at it, and whatever they have to say is not all that useful to them, to the mass movement.
Right.
I kind of share this, like, I have an inner Mandalite, that's like, God, we need that like outpost of, working class experience, of the revolutionary heritage. We need that, organization to carry the torch and the flame to the new movements. But that's just not really how these things pan out.
Okay, but so like if we look at the Mandalite Fourth International as McNair presents it, and then compare it to the other internationals, is the problem here that they weren't willing to do what Marx and Engels were willing to do, of just disbanding when the time was right to disband? Is the problem that they had this inheritance, this bureaucratic centralist inheritance, and they should have been looser, like the Second International?
I kind of agree with that, because what's interesting about the dissolution of the First International is that it opened up space for Marx and in particular Engels to develop the kind of strategy we're talking about today, more or less, which I think was overall a positive development. There's a lot that I love about the First International, don't get me wrong, but sometimes if it's not working out, you got to hang up your towel and rethink your strategy. And I think the legacy of bureaucratic centralism that comes from the Comintern infects Trotskyism still, makes it impossible. They want to maintain the institution for its own sake, is what we're kind of getting at here. And I think that's a problem. Like sometimes you have to like be like, okay, this isn't working out. Let's hang the towel and let's try something different, But
Right.
you tell that to these like Leninist people and like, no, comrade, this is the true Leninist revolution is X, Y, and Z, and they can't like get over their hang-ups on the immortal science,
And does that sort of come out of the idea of the party as the true vanguard?
I think that's part of the inheritance of what is generally termed bureaucratic centralism. It's kind of like similar to the term Stalinism. That's not what they describe themselves as, but that is what what a lot of critics call it. I think vanguardism is kind of part and parcel for that general label.
Because the First International was not really vanguardist, right? It was an association of quite different tendencies in the name of association.
Correct. It was explicitly multi-tendency, basically until they purged Bakunin. But there's reasons for that, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, do we want to hit the last section of this?
Let's do it.
I nominate Pouya.
Let's hear Pouya's golden voice.
Trot Death.
Okay.
Lord of the Serfs.
Oh my God! Don't say that in Euro talk.
Oh no, not me.
Leave Pouya
Machine
alone.
noise expert.
Okay. The need for an international is posed because the working class has concrete, immediate, practical international tasks. These are tasks of class solidarity because the bourgeoisie uses national divisions in the working class to defeat strikes, etc. They are also a task of formulating an independent class perspective on world affairs. These were the lessons of a First International. The need for an international is also posed because the working class can really only understand its own strength and become conscious of itself as a class for itself, by becoming conscious of itself as an international class. This was the lesson of a symbolic role of a Second International. In the third place, the need for an international is posed because the working class cannot take power in a single country and wait for the proletariat of other countries to come to its aid. This is a fundamental lesson of degeneration and collapse of a Comintern and the eventual fall of the Soviet socialist countries. It was a lesson that was not learned by the Trotskyists. The strategic task that this lesson poses for an international is an internationally united struggle of a working class for political power. It should be apparent that the objective political conditions do not yet exist for such a struggle, but they exist for a continental united struggle for political power, which fight for continental unification, Communist Party of Europe, a Pan-African Communist Party, and so on. A dynamic towards continental unification of politics is already visible in bourgeois politics, not just in Europe and in the Latin American Chavista Bolivarians. It is even present in utterly deformed and reactionary manner in the Islamist movement in the Middle East. Comintern was not sterilized by the decision to split from the Social Democrats. It was sterilized by bureaucratic centralism, the idea of a chain of national revolutions, and the idea of a Comintern as a fan club for Russians. Its failure was about the inability of a Comintern to think of international tasks, except either as immediate civil war, which calls for a general staff, or making the national communist parties copy the Russians as a road to victory in a single country. The Trotskyists' 1933 call for a new international was premature. It was not this premature split that turned their project into a swarm of malignant international sects. Rather, it was their too great faithfulness to the ideas of the orderly Comintern, which committed them to the same bureaucratic centralism and the same idea of a chain of national revolutions. This in turn produced the anti-Pavlovite Trotintern and the Trot forms on the one hand, and a Mendelite empty form of international struggle without political tasks on the other. The struggle for international is a present concrete task of the communists. It is clear, however, that this struggle cannot be carried on by creating yet another micro-international. It has to be carried on by fighting on every occasion allows against the bureaucratic centralism and nationalism that go hand in hand with it, and for the concrete tasks of the international. The global struggle for solidarity and immediate class struggle for symbolic unity of a working class as an international class, and the continental struggle for working classes, political unification, and political power. Okay, there's one thing that I wanted to comment on. It's in this paragraph. In the third place, the need for an international is posed because a working power cannot take power in a single country. And this is a fundamental lesson in the collapse of a Comintern and the socialist countries. Well, I think he's using kind of like a... I don't know if his methodology is really... I would really agree with here. Like, I think you can justify this theoretically without this induction from this
single case
event. Yeah, like I think this is like not correct scientific methodology, and also you can also just justify this, theoretically based on economics. I don't get why he produced.
Explain yourself now, Pouya. Like, let's look. We've had communist revolutions in Cuba. We've had even if you want to look at Chavista, those kind of social democratic revolutions. We've had communist revolutions in all number of places like China, Russia, Vietnam, Afghanistan, all these different places, Burkina Faso. But they were all done pretty much on nationalist lines. Pretty much
depends
now.
on how big the country is, I think.
Even Russia descended into nationalism. Biggest goddamn country in the world. Maybe there's hope for Canada.
I mean, it's probably, very unlikely. Imagine, a European country was going to have a revolution. It would be so difficult to maintain that without, to maintain efficient production without having international supports. But, I mean, if you have a very large area of land, you can produce...
Russia.
Yeah, in Russia, it was much more likely that it would, be able to have a planned economy successfully. There was kind of left movements in Europe recently, with Podemos and Syriza. I mean, these are not really the same type, but you can't imagine these countries being able to accomplish political tasks that would conflict with the international order solely due to the fact that they can't produce under autarky.
I think what you're saying is today Russia might be considered a continental bloc of its own. And the reason why it's different nowadays is it's not totally undeveloped. You think today perhaps Russia could survive?
It's more likely, I think.
To bring it back to the book, I think what McNair is trying to say is, I think what is true is that it's not just an inference from one case, but it's an inference from every single case of actual existing socialism of the 20th century. You look at any Leninist state, and either it is collapsed and is explicitly no longer Leninist, or it has capitulated to the free market in some way. That's true with Cuba. The DPRK removed any mention of Marxism or Leninism from its constitution. It's true in China and Vietnam, and I'm pretty sure Laos, although I know the least about Laos. But I think when you're looking at a sample size of all cases,
I don't think the conclusions follow from the premise. He's trying to make a theory out of a fact. You can't make
you can.
Theories can't be produced from facts.
Well, I mean, sure, theories don't come directly from facts, but I mean, This is kind of a problem of doing like historical and social sciences. Like, is that you have to like have. So, there is something that suggests itself immediately from the failure of all these cases. And when I talk to just like a normie kind of like STEM lord, like programmer, there's like, yeah, well, communism failed everywhere. And, you know, what's your third variable that explains it? And I go, the Third International. And they're like, oh, you know, there's a pretty standard like causal argument that we can talk about here. And well, I mean, sure, and if you want a broader causal argument, we can talk about attempts at national determination in a Marxist way that weren't even Leninist, like in Chile. You know what I mean? The same problems end up applying. So,
well, I think it's very important. You know, I think it's.
Oh, I was going to say, like, 10 years' time, America has a communist revolution. It's wildly successful. Everybody is a commie in America. 10 years' time. Can it survive? I think there's a point to say it could survive. It's got nukes. It's got a huge landmass. It could survive. But that's essentially his point here, because he's talking about continental level organizations. So you could say, but Russia, if Russia was more advanced, had more industry now as a capitalist, would it be big enough to, you know, in 10, whatever it was, say if America got to the stage of, or if Russia got to the stage of a Western European country, could it survive? Probably. But that's his kind of goddamn point. It has to be large enough to survive. Is that not his actual explicit point here? And
yeah, but I think, like, I think the conclusions are correct. He's trying to, you know, it's kind of like in these justificationist terms, where it's like, this proves this. And, like, I think that the premise, like, it just doesn't work.
How would you, but I'm actually really curious about this because, you know, like making social and historical kind of causal argumentation is pretty hard. So do you like what, because you agree with the conclusion, do you have like a refined version of the argument that you think follows better?
Well, I think I gave it like a little bit ago.
Say it again.
Spell it out for us.
Labor productivity. It's kind of based on geography.
Okay, I mean, I could see that to an extent, but because we're dealing with the Leninist tradition, that honestly, like, there's this old article by Gramsci, where Antonio Gramsci, who was head of the Communist Party at one point, got thrown in prison, then became a liberal kind of critical theory darling. Anyway, besides the point, he wrote a tiny article called The Revolution Against Das Kapital, where he conceptualized the Bolsheviks as a sort of revolution against the Marxism of the time. And that's pretty much the very important reason that that the Third International has to go through this, like, without recourse to the argument that you just said. Because yes, a good Marxist, a good historical materialist that hasn't been inculcated with trying to defend the Russian lunge at socialism, that's just going to be fucking obvious. And it's kind of even obvious outside of Marxism. But the Leninist tradition is built on an attempt to outwit those historical determinations, those like geographical and economic determinations. Like that's the entire hope of the whole thing. And so I agree with you, but like,
well, I think that Russia doesn't really like go against it because like, I mean, it's a really big country.
Well, I think the issue in Russia is economic development in 1917. It's not so much the size that's the issue. So I think
would agree with that too.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more than just simply geographical size, but that is a very important factor. I agree with you on that too.
I also think it's more important to think of it as like a probability too. Like, you know, it's not like it will for sure work out. Or it will sure not work out.
But like, we're not going to make a Brownian motion argument for my glass of water here in front of me, flipping over and smashing me in the face.
I love Brownian motion.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I think we all agree, but we're just kind of nitpicking here a little bit on the language. Was that a fair point? We all think maybe it's unlikely.
I guess I'm just a poor little psychologist who's inundated with bad social scientific techniques or whatever. Yeah, but I don't really see as much of an issue.
Highly empirical. I think that's what psychology is a lot of the time.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong, but I think
and highly inductivist.
Yeah,
if ever a field needed not to be empirical, it was psychology.
I agree with that actually, but I think I don't really see. Look, I think when you have every single case of Leninism failing or capitulating to capitalism, I don't think it's like a difficult. I don't really see the problem with that argument.
I think I've sort of digested what Pouya is saying here, which is that this proposition that it comes down to single country or not single country is not really a strong argument, right? Because what you should be looking at is the fundamentals that are available to the revolution, not whether it's a single country or not. Because, yeah, like the sort of boundary definition that we get into with the Russian Empire is really, it just kind of throws a wrench in this whole thing, because it's like, is it a single country? Is it a continental bloc? These kinds of descriptive definitions don't really help us very much in describing the likelihood of the success of a revolution.
I think he's probably saying continental bloc and not country. I think he's just shorthand for the vast majority of countries, say in Western Europe, who he's primarily writing about.
I guess what I'm hung up on is the litmus test of Leninism as it existed in history and how it ended up is how I'm conceiving this argument. But I think reading it again right now, and it focuses in on single country as like the issue, I think that is that's not a strong argument. I can agree with that.
The only response that I have is that, like, yeah, the Russian Empire was being treated as a single country in, the main socialism of one country debate, socialism in one country debate. And so I get the idea, that Russia's fucking huge, but the fact that even that ends up being too isolated, former empire that subsumes a bunch of its former colonial subjects into it, is sort of like a litmus test.
Well,
for that.
Like, if you're talking about geographical area, you're talking about like that plus China, plus all the way down to Laos, right? Like,
right.
And Vietnam, right? Like at the maximum extent of expansion.
That's half the world's surface. Half the world's surface.
So this one country idea is like.
Well, but the thing is that they were constantly playing off of each other and ended up splitting. Yeah. They never really had like a coherent, world communist bloc.
It wasn't coherent, but it also wasn't totally insignificant. Like the exchanges between these countries existed. Like, the Vietnam War was financed by both the Soviet Union and China. It just suggests that there's sort of like underlying factors that are more significant than the geographical extent purely.
Agreed. I think that the single country is a problem in the specific context of 1917, not because the former Russian Empire was too small of a geographical area, but because its economic forces were so underdeveloped. That is the crucial issue. That's not saved by the Chinese Revolution, because you have a very similar problem in China, and then eventually when they both start to build up their economic forces, they don't get along anymore.
Yeah, there's still that problem of geopolitical isolation on top of the economic underdevelopment. Like, geopolitical isolation is what makes the autarky hurt so bad, and it apparently isn't helped that much by a huge communist revolution popping off in your same continent.
How big it is probably also affects like how the revolution develops through time. If you have a large section with efficient production, it'll probably, extend geographically much more rapidly.
One thing I'd just like to say is Pouya said that science is not, theories aren't based on the data. Well, what are you talking about, Pouya?
Yeah,
what kind of craziness is that?
No, I mean,
not based on. I think it's a counter-empiricist point. You have to theorize things.
I know that. I'm being sarcastic. But,
okay. I was a little bit confused. But anyway.
Pouya, I can solve Pouya's critique of the entire book with two things. One, if McNair put the word probably in a couple of more sentences. and two, if McNair had said due to the material conditions. So those two phrases, and that'd be it. We wouldn't have these repeated arguments for half an hour.
I think
I'm
this
joking.
is a different.
I'm joking.
Yeah.
No, it's a good point. I'm taking the piss.
I think it's a different argument, though. but
That's
yeah, that would be true. That would be true. Yeah.
Listen, I was trained in psychology. Everything is based on empiricism.
Oh my god, help!
Does anybody have anything else? Because Pouya picked that off about this one. There's other stuff in this paragraph too.
I like the kind of cumulative nature of this section, trying to come up with the lessons of each international, regardless of our scrutiny of his argumentation. I think that's like a laudable goal for a socialist intellectual. If you don't want to get lost in history, but you don't want to ignore it either, you kind of have to be able to pop in and pop out with some cash value of what the fuck does this mean? Like, why is this important? And I mean, I'm not even sure McNair goes like far enough in abstracting in order to do that. But the section just sort of, does kind of surprise me that this ends up with the fight for a new international, considering everything that he's saying. I guess maybe I would want to focus on that last paragraph, because there's a lot about this that I kind of like, that I really, agree with. Like Comintern, it wasn't the split from the Social Democrats. It was this like nationalist focus, this, fake democracy. It's worse than bourgeois democracy. And then, being like a weeaboo for Russia. These are the things that really pervert the Comintern. And then like
a what for Russia?
Pardon me. Weeaboo is terminology for an anime stan that gets really into Japanese like nationalism as a sort of like Orientalist sort of impulse.
And you thought what percentage of the world's population would understand that phrase, that you could just slip it in?
Depends on the generation, because like everyone my age knows what a fucking weeb is.
But a weeaboo.
The same thing. Weeaboo is just weeb is just a short form.
Yeah, just like a Russia stan, or
a Russia-boo.
Yeah.
What is a stan? Does stan come from like Eminem song?
Yes.
I've never heard that one. What does that mean?
Sorry, I've been on Twitter for like a month.
That's just Twitter language.
Yeah, stan is to be a nightmarishly obsessed fan. To be a stan, I stand for this.
So basically, like Sophie stands me. Essentially, that's what you're saying. Like,
wrong. She's standing anyone. She's standing right next to them.
That's
Kyle.
staining. That's staining is different than stand.
Even I didn't go there. Wow.
Oh dear.
Kyle.
Yeah, I think that it's also worth noting that he brings up this idea of the problems of the chain of national revolutions, the idea of the Comintern as a fan club we talked about, but then this idea of the inability to think of international tasks except as either an immediate civil war, which called for a general staff, or making the National Communist parties copy the Russians as a road to victory in a single country. And I think that is a really significant point, that like, because of this legacy, I think a lot of sort of communists are always looking for that civil war opportunity and are always looking for the point at which the Russian mode of organization will be, in their view, useful. And what that means is that the International ignores a lot of other subject matter that may have been more the, like, I mean, you know, you look at the First International and it was in a much more sort of chaotic geopolitical situation in the broad strokes. So I guess they could have been looking for this stuff as well. But, you know, they're looking for those major points of rupture that are going to set off the chain of national revolutions, right? And maybe that is a room, or like that is a space in which this idea of an international could be salvaged, right? Like to say, let's not focus all our energy on that subject. Let's focus on other areas of working class international struggle instead.
And because historically, this, you know, internationalist strategy is associated with anarchism and the old Bolsheviks during their most anarchist friendly point during, like, you know, 1914 through 18. And McNair wants to steer clear of basically a lot of the strategic advice of the left tradition, the abstentionists and the mass strikists, the quote sub-Bakuninists, which is a category that suffers from some great inflation in this book. But that internationalism, he wants to bring into this kind of organizational maybe obsession is not a nice way to put it. But, he wants to abstract that internationalism from the idea of like an immediate civil war and towards something more centrist. And this, path to national revolution stuff is a uniquely centrist position. And I say centrist in the sense of that tripartite thing I was talking about earlier, where you had the retreat on the right, sort of a retreat to capitalism, maybe Menshevism with extra steps, you could say. On the left, you have that global civil war vibe check. And then in the middle, you have, we're not going to give up on socialism, but we can't actually have an international thing. So we're doing it right here. He wants to kind of get out of that, left Comintern and centrist Comintern kind of debate without we're not even talking about the right. This is a debate between Trotsky and Stalin, basically, that he wants to get out of.
Do you think by leaving out Bukharin and the right opposition, that's why a lot of people who read this book kind of end up a version of neo-Bukharinism?
I wonder about that. I think the Bukharinism comes from just some kind of attempt to defend contemporary China at this point. I don't really know where that comes from, other than but you know what? That kind of that makes some sense. It's not Trotsky. It's not Stalin.
Right.
It's a different position. But a lot of those people don't conceptualize Bukharin as retreating, which is wrong. Bukharin had a good historical materialist reason to basically say, well, we tried.
I also don't know if, neo-Bukharinism is such a thing that only exists online, but I haven't really seen a lot of I've seen maybe one neo-Bukharinist really kind of defend China subtly. I don't know if that's a common feature.
Yeah, no, I think
your
intuition is right, that it's an attempt to get out of this without leaving the Comintern.
Right. Yeah. So they want to basically still maintain the Comintern more so than McNair does, even if McNair kind of leaves the door cracked for it. They want to really still defend the Soviet Union. And if according to this book, it's not Trotsky and not Stalin, that leaves one guy, or one, the right opposition in essence.
The only thing I'd say, and I'm sure Derek would scream at me if he heard me saying this, is that I really think that the backdoor, Stalinism stuff is not exactly here. There is something to this book that really does want to leave the Comintern and the Third International behind. I think there's a lot in this book that wants to do that. But, there's this kind of, I guess, if Derek were here, he would stress that there is this kind of ambiguity that's left open. I guess it's not radically different from what you were just saying.
Yeah, it's not like a back door. It's a cracked window to Stalinism that people will break through and have jumped into for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think being a Bukharinist today is a lot harder position to maintain than it was in, when Bukharin was relevant. When Bukharin was alive.
For sure.
Cool. He wrote some nice things about dialectics. What else? We don't live in a semi-feudal country trying to do communism right now. So what's the point? I don't know.
Well, the NEP, I think, is a lot hard. It's not really necessary today like it was then.
Yeah, I can only really see this as a defense of Chinese, Leninism, the only real existing world governing Leninism right now.
Or as a way to be a McNairist and still defend the Soviet Union, because he doesn't really bring up Bukharin often. So, you could be oh, well, that's our guy then, because we still want the Comintern to be cool. So either you're defending Dongism or you're defending the Soviet Union, but I don't think McNair really is trying to go for that, and I think people are mistaken. I think I agree more with Lexi than Derek on this.
That would require some incredible mental gymnastics to come out of this and be
we'll do it.
But Bukharin, right? Think about how Bukharin went down, right? So much of the stuff that McNair's bringing up here is just deep problems that cannot be brushed aside.
Yeah, it's like I don't know, it's like some kind of emo Kautskyism with extra steps. Yeah, Bukharin, got murked by Stalinists. Like, like there's just he wrote this heartbreaking note to someone that, he thought of as an old friend. He had a pet nickname for him, Koba. Why do you need me to die, Koba? Like, why are you doing this? And and for people to take that up as like a position is, I think, an expression of a death wish.
Well, it's an expression of death wish, and also it's made so much more obvious that it is what it is by how these people are usually the first to want to organize with Stalinists. Now, granted, I don't think Stalinists will ever, at least in the United States, will ever have enough power to get anyone executed. They just will make your life miserable, and these people want to just jump right into that and make excuses for these small bean Stalinists,
And like, let's say we sort of accept the Bukharin position, and you look at somebody like Deng, right? And how many times did he have to get thrown in jail by the centrists before he was finally able to execute a Bukharinist program? Like, it's unbelievable that he was actually able to survive and get into power and execute on that idea. And then, I don't know, the results are not... I mean, yeah, I guess the results are defensible in some ways, but whew, oh boy, you look at that, like, you look at it as a totality, and if you want to talk about like socialism as a path to liberation, I don't know.
Yeah,
there's very little liberation there. Well, and I guess it also leads to the next point that's like obvious, but we're not explicitly saying, like, what is the point of? I mean, is the point of doing Daoism after Maoism the fact that like any form of Leninism is just untainable, so you just got to go to like controlled capitalism? Like, why is this? Why, like, are these people so attached to Leninism that they like will just glom onto this absolute failure? Like, I don't understand.
Well, I think that the reasons that Deng gave for pursuing that course could like really sort of overlap with what Kautsky might have said, right? That he just basically said, look, we don't have enough technological innovation in this country in order to survive. We need to find ways in order to get the capitalist countries to develop our productive forces. And otherwise, communism's not happening, right?
Yeah, and the only thing I could say is that, like, the sort of Bukharinist tradition, I don't know, on Swampside we read something by Victor Serge, who, was an anarchist that supported the Bolsheviks, but said, when it wasn't even new economic policy, but it was during war communism that I realized that when they're going to bring back markets, but without like the bourgeois form of liberty. And this is kind of a strained definition, but markets without bourgeois liberty was what Victor Serge ended up calling totalitarianism. And that's how he conceptualized it. It's, maybe not best definition, but like, if you just, thinking about this, is that like Bukharin might have wanted like a drawdown of the stranglehold of political power on intellectual life and that sort of thing. Certainly he would have benefited from it if it wasn't a consistent position. And I can't speak to that, but certainly Bukharinism, basically is a defense of political Leninism, of the political like one party state reigning over a form of capitalism.
So we've struggled now through this chapter for about 8 hours of recording now. It might actually be 10.
What?
25 pages. But like,
oh my Christ.
There's one thing that kind of repeatedly comes to me reading this stuff is, like, as somebody who played poker professionally and somebody who like doesn't play chess at all but follows some chess strategy videos and stuff, how amazingly non-systemic the political decisions that were made by Marxist or communist practitioners in the 20th century. The key people, how they use short-termism over long-term thinking. And I think if there's anything that comes out of this chapter for me, it's the failures of short-term thinking. Now, maybe that's something endemic to human nature and politics. I don't know. But if there's anything we could learn from it, is to think systemically. Any comments on that?
Certainly politics. Human nature, that's a little more of a complicated conversation. There's a lot of configurations of human culture that, can incorporate medium or long-term interests. But, the kind of instrumental reason that dominates in bourgeois society, including one of its most alienated spheres in the political, world. I mean,
how much of it is a function of that kind of short-termism that's inherent in capitalist production?
It's hard. It's really hard to separate, I guess like the Bolsheviks were operating, arguably outside of, a fully bloomed like capitalist society, right? Like, so it's not purely a problem of being around, wages or stuff, full-blown capitalist machinery, or I don't know, several modernization arguments that would say, oh, it's just modern life. But it's certainly something endemic to like politics as we know it. And, like conservative and aristocratic and to a certain extent liberal politicians are better about suspending short-term interests for medium-term interests or long-term interests. I don't know. They don't seem as willing to sacrifice everything right now as we are. What's that about?
We need some human sacrifices. Is that what we're saying? We need human sacrifices.
There's
the Lord God's on our side.
Andy Zaltzman from The Bugle made a joke that says, well, communists, they're a bit like sperm, aren't they? Or Stalinists, at least. 1 million of them have to die for one of them to accomplish anything. Like,
I could say as the resident psychologist here that I can 100% empirically prove human nature is too short-sighted for communism to work.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson.
You're welcome.
I thought you were in rehab. What the hell's going
on? Oh, Tom, if only you knew how appropriate that joke or inappropriate that joke was.
She said no.
But I think the short-termism and is kind of just or the long-term nature of socialism. It's kind of just part of the deal. We can't promise returns immediately like a liberal can.
I'm thinking here about the French Revolution and how it didn't become truly radical until it became short-termist, right? Because of the threat of war. The threat of war radicalized that situation so much, and that was being done by liberals, right? I mean, it's not purely a communist thing. If the situation is sufficiently precarious, then short-termism can carry a lot of weight.
But also bad strategy from not just short-term and liberalism kind of stuff, but this idea of going hell for leather for the Russian Revolution when all the rest of the left in Europe was in tatters. It was we want our one now. And then you come up with a theory for justifying it afterwards, as opposed to systemically thinking about the problem.
Jokes about human nature aside, it should be pointed out, too, that Lenin was kind of inspired by the conspiracy of equals and Jacobinism to a lesser degree. And so I think that's kind of instructive on his thinking.
Yeah, it certainly had an influence on Russian revolutionary culture, even if he didn't necessarily come out of the most sort of pure strain Blanchism.
I wouldn't say he was
see there.
I don't want to say he's a Blancist or a neo-Jacobin. It was influential.
Yeah, they built a monument to Robespierre, the Bolsheviks.
Rips.
Yeah.
I guess it's not to say that in these situations there aren't people who are thinking long term. It's just they tend to get sidelined. They can't make an argument from urgency.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Kautsky, you look at Martov, the Menshevik opposition leader in the Soviet Union, early Soviet Union. There are a lot of people that articulate these critiques at the time when they need to be heard. Anton Pannekoek and Rosa Luxemburg and what have you. I mean, there are, various reasons why some of them get sidelined. I mean, Rosa was straight up murdered. But yeah, when I was, going through some dumb internet farce of one of these splits, you know what I mean? some aggrieved Leninist said, well, people like Kautsky and Martov, they're always going to be outmaneuvered by people like Lenin. They always have and they always will. And it's like, all I said was that's an argument against communism, though. Like, if that's what you think.
That's like, don't ever bother doing anything argument.
You should. They didn't realize that when they were making it. They thought they were like standing for their side, not arguing against it. These people don't realize that they're like reductio ad absurdum, like arguments, walking reasons not to be a communist in human form, making these points. I don't know how else to say it. They seem like counterexamples for good living. And you know what I mean?
Is this why, or at least one reason why, Lincoln is brought up so much as a counterexample, right? Like that he was in a moment of intense political crisis and he did not take the most extreme position based on short-termism despite that crisis situation. Are there examples like that we could look at that maybe would say something more positive?
I don't know. Lincoln is a complex case because on the one hand, politically, it was perhaps more savvy to try to work this out. But on the other hand, what that meant in the context was that he was dragging his feet to end slavery, So I don't know. That's kind of a fraud example, but I think your impulse is correct in that we should try to look for political examples, communist or not, of people who were looking towards long-term strategy instead of short-term strategy and who succeeded,
I think in Northern Ireland, the Republicans, I think, are a very good example. They nearly have, the polls are now, with they've had a long-term strategy of 20, 30 years now. Their long-term strategy, the polls in Northern Ireland now are in favour of United Ireland for the first time ever.
That's awesome.
It's really amazing, seeing this happen. It's just wow. Seeing a long-term strategy pay off like this is just pretty incredible.
Yeah, I want to do a series on it, as a part of the show. I think it'd be very interesting to go into it in depth. But it's all the splits. It's not like the Republican movement didn't have their splits as well. Mm-hmm. They have loads of them. IRA, the Provost, INLA, the goddamn real IRA. There's it's like reading Trot splits. But the core had long-term strategy, and it's whatever we will say about the politics, just looking at it strategy-wise, it's certainly paying off massive dividends, I think. On this episode, you heard the theme tune The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters and The Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening, and please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit and Swampside Chats.